Yo, what is up, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another video. Today, I'm back here again reacting to a Bleacher Report article. It's been a bit since I've done one of these videos, but today I wanted to look back on an article that's gotten a lot of attention over the course of this season because of some of the questionable rankings in it. This was posted back in August of this past year, and it was ranking the 10 worst signings of the 2021 NBA free agency. This is by Zach Buckley. Don't send him any hate. He was trying to predict the future with this one, which is always difficult, but there were some questionable rankings in this one. We'll get to it, especially the number one ranking. That's kind of what most people post about, but I thought it'd be kind of fun to go through this article, kind of look at these signings and see if really they are that bad, knowing now what we know at the All-Star break of the season. So make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let's go and get into it. So starting off at number 10 is Chris Paul, and what I'm guessing he's going to say in this section is, so what he says here is that it's not because Chris Paul's a bad player or anything, or that he's not deserving of $30 million, which he 100% is, signing a 4-year, $120 million contract this past offseason, which he was very deserving of after being one of the most integral pieces to that finals team. You have to give him that money. The problem is he's going to be 40 by the end of that contract, and who knows with Chris Paul? Chris Paul honestly still might be really good when he's 40 years old because it seems like his game continues to age super well. He's nonstop an all-star. He's super valuable to that squad and still one of the better players in the NBA at this point, despite being pretty old and a fairly unathletic point guard. Chris Paul's really he's got a game that ages very well, so he still may be good. But of course, you don't want to be paying a $30 million contract to a 40-year-old point guard by his, at the end of this whole thing, but you had to give him that contract, so I don't really think it qualifies as one of the worst signings. Maybe one of the worst contracts long term, but worst signings, I don't think he really belongs on this list. Number 9 is Kyle Lowry of the Miami Heat, who got a 3-year, $85 million deal. And once again, Kyle Lowry, it's really just a question of his age. So he's around 34, 35 years old, and by the end of this contract, he's going to be like 37, 38 years old. So paying a guy of that age almost $30 million a year is going to be kind of a hard pill to swallow later. But the things that he's been doing for the Heat this season, and his fit was immediately clear how great of a fit he was going to be as a shooter and a playmaker on a team that desperately kind of needed that last season. Kyle Lowry was immediately going to be a really good fit. And so I always thought this was a pretty good signing. It made a ton of sense. Sure, you are going to be paying him when he's older, but for a team like the Heat, whose title window is open right now, you've got to make the moves you've got to make. Number 8 is Daniel Theis, and this is one I agree with just because it never really made sense to me. At this point, they had Christian Wood, Alperen Sengun, Usman Garuba, and then they added Daniel Theis as a 4th big. Sure, Garuba is more of like a G League guy. He's not as ready, and Sengun, he's young and he's still developing. But bringing a guy like Daniel Theis to kind of play as a veteran never really made sense to me when you're trying to develop a young core. Christian Wood himself is even young, so why would you bring in like a backup big, especially someone who can't really play well with Christian Wood, as was evident over the course of this season. Theis is a fine player. I'm not saying he's a bad player or anything like that, and $9 million isn't a lot to pay him. It just never really made sense to me that the Rockets were the one to give him this contract. Now, he has been traded to the Boston Celtics, of course, so this era is over, but it just kind of goes to show how much it didn't really work out over the course of this half season. Number 7 is Zach Collins. This was a weird contract because Zach Collins never really plays. He's been injured for most of his career. He's only 23 years old, if not 24. I'm not sure if he's had his birthday since this article was made. But Zach Collins is still relatively young, of course. It's just, even in the minutes he has been on the court, he hasn't been super productive. He's shown flashes here and there. He just can't really stay healthy, and even then, he hasn't shown a ton in his time. I'm not saying he's bad or anything like that when he's on the court. I don't know. It just always felt like a weird contract. Now, 3 years, $22 million is not expensive at all. Like, that's a fairly cheap contract for a guy with a ton of potential. And for the San Antonio Spurs, they are a team that can take a flyer on a guy like Zach Collins looking to bring in a big of maybe the future. Even if he's just a backup, locking up for cheap and kind of just seeing what you have there. For a team that's rebuilding and isn't really a free agency destination, I don't think this contract's that bad. Number 6 is Duncan Robinson of the Miami Heat. This is one we can talk about this one a little bit because 5 years, $90 million is a lot for Duncan Robinson. Now, he is one of the best shooters on the planet. He's been super integral to the success of that team since he got there. it's just always a problem with shooters because shooters have become such a premium. You need shooters in the modern NBA. Every great team needs like at least one really, really good shooter. It's kind of just the nature of basketball right now. And if you don't have really like one really great specialist shooter, you at least have a bunch of good shooters. And Duncan Robinson is that specialist shooter. Now, he's been up and down over the course of this season. Sometimes he'll be like really cooking, sometimes he'll be kind of struggling. So it's been a back and forth affair with Duncan Robinson. It's just always a question of how will that contract age? And for a guy who's only 27, like, he'll only be 32 by the end of that contract. So it's not like he's going to get super old. The worry is always like, you could have a Davis Bertans situation where you pay him a ton of money and then he falls off a cliff. Now, I think Duncan Robinson is just straight up a better shooter than Bertans was when he got that contract. So I don't think it's going to age that poorly. I think Duncan Robinson is a good fit, and the Heat did have to pay him. They had to give him this money, and they're the 1 seed, or tied with Chicago for the 1 seed, out there in the Eastern Conference right now. So the contract is working out so far. It's just a question of how will it age. And once again, when you're in a title window like the Heat, you've got to pay that money. Number 5 is Kelly Olynyk. This is an understandable one. Once again, it never really made a ton of sense. Now, Kelly Olynyk was really good for the Rockets after the trade deadline last season with the whole Victor Oladipo trade. When he got to Houston, he was really good. I think he averaged like 19 points per game almost with Houston in that last stretch of games. He was shooting the lights out. It's not been the case with the Pistons. I believe he's shooting like 29% from 3, which is what he's supposed to be good at. And when you've got a young big like Isaiah Stewart who you're trying to develop, it doesn't make a ton of sense to have a guy like Kelly Olynyk on the roster. Sure, you need some veterans, and maybe he's a good mentor, but paying him $12 million to kind of just chill and not really do what he's supposed to do, it's just not a great contract. It's not super egregious because $12 million isn't that bad, but, you know. Number 4 is Devonte Graham. Contract's not that big. 4 years, $47.3 million, which is about $12 million a year, which I don't think is really that bad of a contract. Always the question mark is, and yeah, Zach's going to mention it here, the whole Lonzo Ball thing. Like, why didn't they just keep Lonzo if they wanted a point guard who could shoot and play make, which is what Lonzo did, plus play defense. So it did make a lot of sense. The sign and trade really in particular was the confusing part. Now, they did have to go out and get a point guard, and I think Devonte Graham is fine. The problem is, now that you've got CJ McCollum, which of course nobody knew that was going to happen when this signing happened, but now that they've got CJ McCollum, where does Devonte Graham go from here? Because when fully healthy, I feel like your best starting lineup is CJ, Herb Jones, Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and Jonas Valanciunas. Devonte Graham is not in that, and $10 million isn't bad, and he might even be better as a backup point guard. It just brings up some question marks, so we'll see how it goes going forward, but And it says here, Devonte Graham may only be keeping the seat warm for Kira Lewis Jr. or Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker's gone now. Of course, bringing in CJ McCollum, who is a better player. So we'll see what goes on with that. Number 3 is Evan Fournier. And yeah, this one it's not great because... So I like this contract when it happened. I did think it was kind of a bit of money. It's right around $20 million a year. The problem was the Knicks had no offense. Last year in the playoffs, the reason they lost to the Hawks was nobody could really score. And so when you bring in a guy like Evan Fournier, who's been right around 20 points per game for a lot of his career, it makes sense. And a contract like that does make sense for Evan Fournier. But like the Knicks have kind of been all season, it made more sense on paper than it's making sense in actual games. And unless he's playing the Boston Celtics, Fournier has been super up and down this season. He hasn't quite been the offensive producer that they need him to be. And so paying him almost $20 million a year, it's a lot of money. Like I said, I thought this was a fine contract when it happened, but now that we're actually seeing it act out, seems like Zach was kind of right here. I don't love this contract at all. Number 2 is Jarrett Allen, which is very surprising to me because me personally, I loved this contract from day one. Jarrett Allen is always a center that I've really liked. And when you looked at the personnel in Cleveland with Darius Garland, Colin Sexton, they needed that size. And so bringing in a guy like Jarrett Allen who can kind of score a little bit down low, he's a great rebounder. And in particular, he's a great lob threat, which I think is huge for a point guard like Darius Garland. And I think Jarrett Allen's ability to dive to the rim, grab boards, get new possessions, and just overall be a rim protector in that force down low has been huge for the development of a guy like Darius Garland, who giving him that weapon I think has been really big and really helped him showcase his playmaking. So I always thought Jarrett Allen was going to be a good contract, especially when you take into account that $20 million is not a lot of money for a guy like Jarrett Allen, who seemingly had all-star potential, and he now is an all-star this season. So good for Jarrett Allen. Here he said he was concerned about the spacing with Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley, but of course Mobley is a decent enough shooter, and it hasn't really been a problem. He's also questioning here, who were the Cavs bidding against? Like, could they have gotten him for cheaper? Overall, they just paid their franchise center, and I think that contract already looks like a steal this season. And if he continues to get better, which he could because he's only in like his 5th year in the NBA, that contract could become even more of a steal down the line. And finally, number one, and the reason we're talking about this article, the reason this article ever comes up, DeMar DeRozan to the Chicago Bulls. 3 years, $85 million. And when we take a look at specifically what Zach has says in this article, because I have come back to this a couple times, it gets a little bit worse. So he said that the gap between any two spots on these rankings might be the widest at the top. Look past DeMar DeRozan's pregame or per game production, 21.6 points and 7 assists, and you'll see a 32-year-old who's a poor fit with his new club and limited in worrisome ways for someone aging past his prime. He's never been a good defender, which won't help the team with Zach LaVine and Nikola Vucevic. His playmaker growth won't help. Moving him off ball will only highlight his limited shooting range, and it shrinks the floor. There were thoughts that maybe they could get him for the mid-level exception, or that someone would, so it's a bad contract. It costed them Thad Young, Al-Farouq Aminu, and a first-round pick, which is funny looking back on that. And he says that you could argue that Thaddeus Young, who will cost $14 million next season, contributes more to winning than DeMar DeRozan. So it's not a great look from Zach on this. Now, I will give Zach a little bit of slack here because nobody knew DeRozan was going to be an MVP candidate. The most diehard DeRozan and Bulls fans did not expect him to be in like the top 4 in MVP voting at this point in the season. But DeMar DeRozan has really shattered all his expectations. And even without shattering those, me and many others thought this was a good fit. I made a video about the Chicago Bulls earlier in the offseason, and I talked about how I thought the Bulls made a lot of really good moves, and I thought DeRozan was going to be a super fun piece here. He was a borderline all-star last season, and even if he just was like a borderline all-star caliber player like he was last year on this Bulls team, I still think the move would have been pretty good. But when you take into account the way that he has elevated this team completely, taken over as the number one scoring option, been one of the best scorers in the league, probably the best clutch player, or at least one of the best clutch players in the league over the course of this season, DeRozan's contract is a huge steal for a guy like him. He's really been the reason why the Bulls have been elevated so much to the point where they're tied for the first seed at the All-Star break. And I just think it's hilarious looking back on this as someone who completely believed and was super fond of the DeMar DeRozan signing for the Chicago Bulls. It's funny to look back on an article like this that hated it and kind of see the difference between those two perspectives. So those are my thoughts on this article. Let me know if you like the DeRozan signing in the offseason in the comment section below. It's a judgment-free space. We won't judge you too much if you say you hated it. I'm just kind of curious what y'all are thinking. I appreciate y'all watching. Let me know what you thought were some of the best and worst signings of this past offseason. Was there something that now kind of looks like one of the worst offseason signings that wasn't mentioned in this article, and which one of these did you think was the most egregious? Maybe outside DeRozan, because that one was pretty clear. But I appreciate y'all watching. I'll see you all later. Real One Say.